Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Things Policy. An advisory group chaired by the principal scientific advisor has been formed to develop an AI for India specific regulatory framework. The subcommittee within this group has released a report on developing AI governance guidelines, and that's currently open for consultation. So, my name is Bharath Reddy, and I have with me my colleague Rijesh Panicker. We are both researchers with the High Tech Geopolitics program at the Takshashila Institution. And what we're going to do now is try to unpack some of the recommendations from this report, and maybe look at what's good, what's not, and what could be done to get the desired outcomes from the AI governance point of view. So quickly to summarize what the takeaways from the report itself. So the report starts off with broad principles of AI governance. So they talk about, so these are largely derived from the OECD principles and Niti Aayog and NASSCOM efforts to define AI governance principles. So they largely look at transparency, accountability, safety, reliability, and robustness, privacy and security, fairness and non-discrimination, human-centered values, and do no harm, inclusive and sustainable innovation, and digital by design governance. So these are the broad principles that they've laid out right up front. Then they look at a life cycle approach to AI governance. So they're not looking at just once something has been deployed, but they're looking at the development process, the deployment process, and the diffusion process as well, which is when a technology gets adopted widely and across multiple sectors and domains. So it's a life cycle approach for maybe nurturing the technology as well as safeguarding risks along the life cycle of that technology. That's the broad approach here. And then they also define an ecosystem view of the AI actors, where they look at all these stakeholders that are involved in the AI ecosystem, starting from data principals to data providers, AI developers, which includes model builders, AI deployers, which includes app builders and distributors, and end users, including both businesses and citizens. So all of these stakeholders and their interests are something that is considered while drafting these guidelines. And then they finally come out with a set of recommendations, a set of, I think, 6 recommendations. I'll just list them out here, and before we then try to unpack what's in these recommendations and analyze them. So the first recommendation is on a whole of government approach to AI governance. So they recommend forming an interministerial AI coordination committee or governance group, and this will be an empowered mechanism to coordinate AI governance. So it requires a lot of stakeholders working together, and they've come up with this whole of government approach, which is headed by a interministerial group. The second recommendation is on a technical secretariat. So, to develop a systems level understanding of India's AI ecosystem, MeitY should establish and administratively house a technical secretariat to serve as a technical advisory body and coordination focal point to the committee or group. Right? So, that's the second recommendation. The third one is on building an incident database. So this is defined as to build evidence on actual risks and to inform harm mitigation. The technical secretariat should establish, house, and operate an AI incident database as a repository of problems experienced in the real world. And this should guide responses to mitigate or avoid repeated bad outcomes. So that's the third one. And the fourth one is on voluntary commitments on transparency across the overall AI ecosystem and on baseline commitments to full capability and widely deployed systems. Right. So that's voluntary commitments from people who are building and deploying these systems, that they're going to be transparent and they're going to have disclosure on a bunch of parameters that have been identified. The fifth one is that the technical secretariat should examine the suitability of technological measures to address AI related risks. So, technological measures in this recommendation, they have given an example of proliferation of malicious synthetic media or fake news or deep fakes, and how that should be mitigated, or how that can be controlled using technological means. At other points in the document, they also talk about techno legal measures to enforce governance. Techno legal measures is something where the law is encoded within the code, and if you're trying to work with this framework or code, then you're automatically forced to comply with the law, right? You would have maybe heard about the DEPA framework, where you minimize data collection and purpose limitation of data so that it's used only for a particular purpose for a particular time duration, and there's consent involved and all of these things. So that's one way of enforcing data and compliance with the laws, just by having stakeholders comply with the code that they're interacting with. And the last recommend, so the techno legal thing, interestingly, is not a part of the recommendation, but it finds mention in other parts of the document where they discuss this as a possible way to enforce governance. And the last recommendation is to form a subgroup to work with METI to suggest specific measures that may be considered under the proposed legislation, like the Digital India Act. So, to give inputs to METI, to strengthen it, to harmonize the legal framework, regulatory and technical capacity, and all of these things. So, to aid those efforts, the interministerial group, or the committee under the technical secretariat, would be forming another subgroup to be able to give inputs to this. So these are broadly the recommendations and a quick summary of what this report covers. Now I'll hand it over to you, Rijesh, to share your thoughts on what you think are the what's good about it, what do you like about it, what you don't, and what would you have liked to see in this.
Great. Thanks, Bharath. So yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, right? It's a pretty interesting report with a nice set of principles that they've followed to come up with these recommendations. If we broadly bucket this into good and say maybe and say things that we don't like or bad, although they're not necessarily bad, I would say that the good things that I like from this, from the current set of principles and recommendations, it's quite light touch. That the interministerial committee is going to be set up, and they're trying to make an incident database, with I think is a great thing. It could be a good public good, a digital good that India can contribute to the world. I mean, if and even otherwise, most of the standards they're trying to build are around best practices, voluntary compliance, talk to the stakeholders, which, if anybody has been following the whole DeepSeek open AI saga, right, things change at a drastic pace in the AI world. And it's a good thing that at least in principle, they're not trying to come in setting hard standards. And for example, I think the US AI Act executive order, which was trying to set specific compute limits and all of that, was probably not the right way to go about it, looking at things that have happened since. So from that perspective, I think this method is good. It's a very light touch approach to it, so that's great. Like I was saying, the AI incident database is a great idea. If we can do it well, assuming it's a public good, which I really hope it is, it will spur a lot of research if people get access to it, because the private players and academics will have a genuinely good data set in which to do further research on what kind of risks are showing up when there are interaction between AI systems, which will eventually happen, what kind of unintended consequences happen, things like that. There could be a lot of interesting academic research coming out of it. So I think it's a great thing to have. And it also helps India if we provide this kind of a data set to the world, right? Then you have a seat at the table when these kind of conversations happen. So I think that's an unmitigated good from the report that we should definitely try and do well.
On the incident database, I think it's not explicitly mentioned in the report that it will be an open database, or that it will
Correct.
be.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it could well turn out to be one of those things where they gather data, but it's only being used by the government, and which would definitely be one of our recommendations. That should not be the case. It should be an open database where academics and the contributors and actually the public at large should have access to it. So anyone can research on it and come up with new insights. I genuinely hope that that's how it works out.
Just to add to that again, because it's all voluntary, because you're saying it's a voluntary incident database, it's a voluntary compliance thing.
It's a nice way to incentivize companies.
So,
If they know that
yeah,
by reporting stuff, they're
you
also going to get access to the data set, it's a nice incentive for a company to do that reporting. So which is good.
yeah.
In terms of the maybes, I think there were two things that really stood out for me. One is the whole of government approach principle that they've spoken about, and there's an interministerial committee, which is good, which is important, because AI is sort of a horizontal technology. It will have implications across multiple sectors, and there will be trade-off for each ministry to take care of, and so you do need an interministerial committee. But one of the things that we both felt was that perhaps this committee under a PSA is not really empowered enough, right? The question is, should this be a cabinet level committee headed by the PM or somebody, because there will be trade-offs to be made in terms of some things you may have to do or not do which will impact some other sector, and you'll have to think about the budgets, and there will be strong opposition to some moves. So maybe the committee needs some kind of a stronger anchor, rather than the PSA, who is a scientific advisor, which was one thing. The second was the technical secretariat itself, which is a nice idea. I don't believe that they wanted to be a permanent body right now, if I remember the report correctly. But to me, the key question there is, who, like, that technical secretariat, the way it's written in the report, it sounds like it's predominantly going to be staffed by MeitY, which I kind of have an issue with. I take issue with that idea because I think MeitY is at the center of a lot of the actual work on the AI mission. So they are players in the market in some sense, right? They're executing it. So therefore, they should not also be on the regulatory side of it in such a central position. I mean, they should be one of the stakeholders for sure. But I question if the technical secretariat should be under MeitY or if it should be strictly under the PSA with MeitY contributing members to it. So that's a maybe part of it.
So I think this comes down to one of the principles that you need to keep in mind when designing policy, or what roles that departments or different committees play, right? So ideally the steering and the rowing roles need to be kept separate and isolated from each other. And if you look at the different things that MeitY would be playing in this policy life cycle, it's in an advisory capacity in some of these roles as mentioned in the guidelines, and it's also in a policy making capacity as part of drafting the legislation or getting it passed, and then it will also be a part of the implementation capacity as part of, say, executing on the India AI mission, which covers a lot of things from building compute to encouraging startups to building data sets and safety and all of these things, right? So that's, I think, the distinction that we're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, the things that I thought were not completely clear. One is the whole techno legal mechanism idea. In principle, it's an interesting idea, but it's fairly opaque, right? We I think we've spoken about this in the past as well. That if you embed law in technology, then the law can be updated simply by changing code, and that doesn't then need further review. So it's always a dangerous idea to, or at least it's an idea that should be thought through carefully about how do you apply technological measures as a implementation of law. The second thing was that the competition, the CCI is not explicitly mentioned, the Competition Commission of India, and I think it should be, because this is an area where we will likely see a lot of market action. I assume that they will be a stakeholder even though it's not mentioned, but I think it's worth explicitly saying they should be a member of any of these committees. Uh, then another thing that I thought was not clear on it, they talked about diffusion as one of the principles in the report, right? That is that they want to make laws that also look at how things play out after AI systems are deployed in the market. They want to look at unintended consequences, but I don't think any of the recommendations actually expands on that diffusion idea, because if you really think about it, the best way to do that would be to have some kind of like a sunset or a review process as part of this committee, where it says, look, we'll set out a set of laws and rules, even whether they are voluntary or mandatory, but every year, every 18 months, because it's AI, it's moving very fast. So let's say every 12 months to 18 months, we'll go back and review and to say what works, what doesn't work, and keep changing. So they haven't actually talked about it. I mean, again, it may or may not come in the law, but I think that's worth calling out, because if you really want to handle the diffusion part of that system, how is the ecosystem evolving over time, how are they responding to the laws that we set out, we need to have specified sunset windows, review timelines. There should be somebody, I don't know, maybe the technical secretariat should be tasked with reviewing how useful a law is every 12 months, 18 months. I think that should be explicit, because it will help. That's the only way you'll keep up with the rate of change. So that's broadly what I thought. Anything stood out for you from that we should dive into?
No, so broadly these, but I think another area which would, like, light touch is good when you're talking about incentivizing innovation and all of these things, but there'll be a lot of cases where the government adopts AI systems for delivering public services or for its own use cases, right? So maybe it's when you're saying that you need transparency and disclosure on a lot of these things, a good way to encourage that would also be in publishing how the government does procurement of these AI systems. What are the conditions that it looks, criteria that it looks for? How disclosing, requiring vendors who are deploying these systems to be transparent about mandating it as a procurement policy that you need to comply with this, and then only you'll be eligible for procuring it, right? So those kind of things might incentivize, at least at the vendor level, what they comply it, and then that will slowly trickle down to other
Correct.
parts of the market as well.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, so while they have spoken about creating standards and best practices that the private sector will voluntarily comply with, that is the idea they're going with. It's yes, it should definitely be the case that the government itself should say that while it may be voluntary for the private sector, it's definitely mandatory for the public sector. As in, the government should say we will definitely adhere to these standards. Release our reports, release our the AI incidences, and all of that. So yeah, I agree with you completely on that.
And a lot of this, because it's also voluntary, you need active participation from these different stakeholders, and you need continuous engagement from diverse stakeholders. So building that community of practice, in a sense, where you engage with different stakeholders, get their point of view, and be transparent about what the different concerns that are submitted, and publishing these consultations. All of these things are some things which I think are necessary to make that process more consultative, make it more transparent. So those are general things that we always keep saying are required. But yeah, so far, these guidelines are proposing some light touch interim measures while they work on a Digital India Act, which will then maybe set the longer term AI governance, the legislation for that. So while this is a good step, it's still not clear where that will be headed. So
Right, and it's also not clear to me if all of the outcomes of these will get subsumed within the Digital India Act, or if the committee's recommendations are going to be such that multiple ministries will have to make changes to their laws. So none of that is clear yet, and that's also important to understand, right? Like, it comes back to the same thing we said. MeitY is actually a central player in this whole thing. Like, they are building out, they are responsible for the Digital India Act. They are executing a lot of the India AI mission. They are going to be responsible for a lot of the procurement of compute. So they have their fingers in many pies. So I think the committee has its work cut out, right? Like, the trade-offs are real, and there's going to be a lot of pushback, and they'll have to come up with a set of policies that actually work for everyone, and don't just end up being dominated by any one ministry, whichever ministry that might be.
right, and I think that's in a sense why we are also talking about a more empowered committee, which can help balance these interministerial trade-offs that might be there. So that's in a nutshell what we were thinking about this. And if you thought this was interesting, please reach out to us and let us know what you think. The recommendations, I mean, the consultation is open till the 27th of Feb. So if you have a point of view on this, do consider responding to the consultation as well. And we hope you enjoyed listening to us, and thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.